Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
This week, US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced he's cancelling 22 vaccine development projects worth $500 million US, specifically targeting mRNA technology used in COVID-19 vaccines. The decision has sparked concern from infectious disease experts who say it could leave America vulnerable to future pandemics. On today's podcast, we're going to dive into what these cuts actually mean, why we're seeing such dramatic changes in US health policy, and whether similar changes could actually come to Australia.
So Sam, this story all centres around RFK Jr., who is now in charge of America's health policy.
Yeah.
For anyone who's not familiar with him, do you want to just give us a quick overview about who is RFK Jr.?
Yeah, so this is the main character of this story, I'd say. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is Donald Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Which is kind of like our Minister for Health?
Exactly. So it's the Mark Butler of America. He's from the famous Kennedy political dynasty. He's the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy. Now, before entering politics, RFK was an environmental lawyer, but over the past 20 years, he's become a really prominent vaccine skeptic. He's repeatedly questioned vaccine safety, particularly during the COVID pandemic, and he linked vaccines to autism, despite overwhelming scientific evidence showing no connection there. He founded an organisation called the Children's Health Defence that spreads what experts say is vaccine misinformation. And what's really significant now is, as you said, he is in charge of America's health system. So he oversees multiple health agencies. The ones that we would know and be familiar with would be the CDC, the Centre for Disease Control, and the FDA, which regulate and recommend vaccines and medications.
I remember the CDC, the Centre of Disease Control, was very prominent during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I think maybe a lot of us would know it from there.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, he
Yes.
was the figurehead.
Yes. So this was a pretty dramatic move from RFK Jr. to cut funding for a lot of vaccines in the US. Do you want to just break down exactly what that announcement was this week?
Sure. So it was on Tuesday, US time, and RFK got up and announced that the Department of Health and Human Services will cancel contracts and pull funding for 22 projects. And when you bundle all of those projects together, the total amount of funding being pulled is $500 million US, which is about 770 million Australian dollars.
And is this funding into the rollout of vaccines or funding into the research of future vaccines?
It's more in that second bucket. So It's
Right.
more about the development of vaccines, particularly the ones that use mRNA technology to fight respiratory viruses.
Remind me what that is.
So mRNA technology, I'll get to in a sec, but the respiratory viruses that we would know about from a vaccine context would be COVID-19, the flu, and bird flu.
Familiar.
Yes. And so the contracts being cancelled, they involve some of America's biggest pharmaceutical companies. We're talking about Pfizer and Moderna. And those are the companies that we know developed the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. And so Kennedy comes out with this video explaining his decision. And he says, to replace the troubled mRNA programs, we're prioritizing the development of safer, broader vaccine strategies like whole virus vaccines and novel platforms that don't collapse when viruses mutate.
And to translate that into us non-scientific folk?
So basically what he's saying there is they're putting energy and money into developing a universal vaccine. So what's one vaccine that can adapt on the fly within the human body and fight any virus that comes along? The weakness with the mRNA vaccine, in Kennedy's view, is that with every iteration of a virus like COVID, you need a new modification to the vaccine.
Right.
And so he's looking for this idea of a universal vaccine, a one-stop shot. Do you like that?
I get it.
Instead of a vaccine that, when a virus mutates, isn't useful anymore.
Okay, that makes sense. And to go back to my earlier question, what exactly is mRNA technology?
So basically, it's a type of technology where scientists create a snippet of genetic code that carries instructions for how the body can make a protein that can fight a virus. So they pick a protein to target from a virus, they inject the instruction manual into the code of the vaccine, and your body then makes enough of that protein to trigger a protection from the virus. So it basically helps your body produce its own vaccine dose. Now, the big advantage to mRNA technology is the speed at which it can be developed. And that's something we talked a lot about during the pandemic because mRNA vaccines were developed in record time. And in the early stages of the pandemic, when we were talking about traditional vaccines, we were talking about years of development time needed. mRNA vaccines can potentially be created in months. Now, infectious disease experts say that the technology could be crucial for responding to future pandemics, especially in current concerns around bird flu in the US, where it's potentially spreading to humans.
Don't tell us that.
I'm sorry.
You can't tell us there's another pandemic on the way.
Well, I mean, this has been a really interesting legacy from the pandemic is looking at pandemic preparedness. And there's a really interesting perspective for countries now of how ready is a country if another pandemic was to arrive on our doorstep.
Okay, so to sum up where we kind of are in this story,
Yeah.
mRNA technology is renowned for being very speedy, which is good when new viruses emerge that you need to more quickly respond to.
Exactly.
And RFK Jr. has pulled funding from that. Now, neither you or I are vaccine experts.
Yeah.
So what have the experts said about this?
It's such an in-depth area of science. Let's talk about what the people who actually know what they're talking about are saying. So, I mean, the basic concern is that America could be caught unprepared for the next pandemic. And experts argue that the rapid development capability of the mRNA vaccines could be the difference between containing a new virus quickly or facing another health crisis. So Jerome Adams, who was the Surgeon General for the bulk of Donald Trump's first term, he wrote on X this week that while he has tried to be objective and non-alarmist about recent decisions made by RFK Jr., quite frankly, this move is going to cost lives. And that's somebody who was appointed by a Trump administration, which I thought was really interesting. There's a leading academic expert on infectious diseases, Mike Osterholm, and he said, "I don't think I've seen a more dangerous decision in public health in my 50 years in the business."
Wow. And obviously, Donald Trump, the US president, is the person who appointed RFK Jr. So I imagine that he's in support of this.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
He gave Kennedy really significant freedoms to reshape American health policy. He's previously said he wants RFK to, quote, go wild on health and food policy. It's interesting with Trump because during his first presidency, Trump actually supported the development of mRNA technology. It was called Operation Warp Speed, and it was this big investment in funding to develop COVID vaccines really quickly. At the time, Trump called mRNA vaccines a medical miracle. Now, in recent years, especially after the pandemic, he has expressed increasing skepticism about vaccines. And we can, I guess, look to the fact that he has appointed RFK Jr. in this position as an indication of where he stands on the issue. There's one really interesting comment I wanted to tell you about. So in the press conference this week with RFK Jr., when asked whether Trump is satisfied with his performance in the role in the first 6 months, RFK Jr. said Trump calls him multiple times a week, always with the same question: why aren't people healthier yet? That was kind of cool. I mean, that's a very blunt question.
Cool is one way to describe it.
Yeah, very interesting. I can only imagine the conversation those two are having.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something you said earlier, because what you've said is that RFK Jr. is not saying that we should cut vaccines altogether from what you said. You're saying that he thinks that there should be a universal vaccine. What does that look like? And is that possible?
Well, it's largely theoretical at this stage. That's according to scientists and experts in the field. Scientists have been trying to develop an idea of a universal vaccine, even just a universal flu vaccine, for decades, and they haven't been able to be successful in that. Essentially, a universal vaccine would mimic natural immunity, and it would then be effective against both coronavirus and flu, but also any other virus that we might not even know about yet. And it essentially would stimulate the body's natural immunity function. As I said, it's a promising idea, but scientists have no timeline on how this can be developed and if, and when it could be available in the wider market.
And if we were to bring this back to an Australian context, is there any signal from the Australian government that they will move in a similar direction at all in line with the US?
No signal at all, really. I mean, there hasn't been a direct response to RFK's policy changes this week, but we can look to the investment in vaccine research and rollout as a pretty safe. It's bipartisan, as it's supported by everyone. It's part of our health framework. So I can pretty safely say that the government would not be looking to follow this path.
In Australia, it's bipartisan.
Yes,
meaning
exactly.
it's supported by basically both sides of parliament or all sides of parliament.
Yes, but what I did think was interesting is that there has been a number of stories that have come into the news over the last couple of months about the changing attitudes of Australians towards the flu vaccine, for example. There's been a steady decline in the percentage of adults in Australia who are getting the flu vaccine, and hospital admissions from flu have spiked this year by up to 50% in some states. And a 2024 survey published in the Medical Journal of Australia found that about 1 in 5 said they would not get a government-offered vaccine in a future public health emergency, while another 17% said they were uncertain whether they would or wouldn't. So we can kind of say that about 40% of Australians are either hesitant or outright against a government-offered vaccine.
It would be interesting to know what those stats were prior to the pandemic and to kind of look at how it's changed since. But I think from everything that you've said, it's clear that there kind of are seemingly changing attitudes about vaccinations.
Definitely. And there's a clear delineation from pre-pandemic attitudes to post-pandemic attitudes, particularly in children. And that was something that our health minister, Mark Butler, touched on in June when he got up and released a new national immunisation strategy.
Do you mean children getting vaccinations or the attitudes of children?
No, so I don't. The type of age of children we're talking about here probably don't have vaccine attitudes just yet at 6 months to 3.
Right.
But the attitude of their parents to be getting children vaccinated has changed, and it's kind of going down about 1 or 2% a year. So Mark Butler got up in June and released this new national strategy. And part of that strategy was a direct opposition to another move that RFK did. RFK had announced a couple of weeks before that America would withdraw its funding for Gavi, which is the Global Vaccine Alliance. In Mark Butler's strategy, he announced a $386 million boost in funding to that body between 2026 and 2030. One interesting angle that we can talk about in terms of the effect of RFK's decision this week is actually the opportunities it presents in terms of Australia's capabilities to make and even one day export mRNA vaccines. So CSL and Moderna, they're the two biggest producers of mRNA vaccines in Australia. They've got large vaccination facilities now in the country. Experts say that Australia wouldn't be quite prepared today if there was another pandemic to roll out rapidly and universally a vaccine program. So we're not quite at the stage where we would look at exporting it to other countries. But if you think about how much America produces in this space, if that was all cut, there would be some openings in the global export landscape, which is a quirky way to look at it, but an interesting take.
So interesting, such a topical story at the moment. Sam, thank you for explaining it to us today.
Thanks, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your evening headlines, but until then, have a great day.